welcome to the Writer Center. For everybody who has been here before, I missed you. For everybody who has not been here before, I missed you too. You're not here to hear me, although I think you're going to rethink that after I finish my leading remarks. No, I'm going to introduce our board chair. You're at the Writer Center, literary arts nonprofit. We're supporting writers and people who want to write, and tonight, readers. I'm delighted to welcome our board chair, Bill Levini, who's going to say other things.
I'm also supposed to come here to listen to, but I just want to thank everyone here for coming. I love the Writer Center, and this is my favorite event that we do every year. The Fitzgerald Society does such a great job with their whole weekend, and tonight's event is always fantastic every year. The honorees are always top-notch, and the guest readers are just fantastic too. Every year I found at least one or two new authors that I'm really excited about. Bear with me for just a second while I do a quick plug for the Writer Center. I was really excited to hear that Mr. Powers was the honoree this year because over his winter break, I read his Three Farmers on the Way to a Dance. And I remarked to my wife, the second chapter is really incredible. It talks about the three farmers in Germany on the eve of World War I. And the voice is just incredible. It's kind of sparse and detached, but it also creates a really intimate portrait of these three guys, these young men, as they're walking to the dance. And it gives an incredible sense of place of pre-World War I Germany. And it's just an incredible piece of prose. So what does that have to do with the Writer Center? Well, prose and the voice like that just doesn't spring out naturally, at least not for most of us. So that's where the Writer Center comes in. We offer classes to help refine aspiring and even experienced writers' techniques. We have classes in all sorts of genres, poetry, science fiction, memoirs, all sorts of skills, character development, plotting. And what happens is a lot of times after these classes, the students get together and form writing groups to meet and discuss their reading and read for one another. And we have meeting rooms downstairs that our groups often use to talk with one another and flesh out ideas. We've also got carols downstairs, which sometimes which is sometimes the hardest part of writing, is get your backside in the seat and getting words out on the paper. And we also do events like this where there are readings, and we hope that fosters a wider writing community where you can make more connections and bounce ideas off one another and learn more things. And so really what we're trying to do is, there was a former honoree, Richard Russo, wrote a book about the writing process, in which he talks about developing his voice and how he, at one point he almost gave up. And he said, well, the sad truth is a lot of talented writers give up every day. And that is something we try and prevent. It would be awful if someone, a talented writer gives up. And so that's what the Writer Center is about. If you have an interest in writing or hearing about literature, I hope you don't give up and you come here and give us a chance. Thanks.
And donate. Donations are a great way of showing your support for the Writer Center. I'm thrilled to introduce Priyanka Champaneri. She received her MFA in creative writing from George Mason University, has been a fellow at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts numerous times. Her debut novel, The City of Good Death, which I highly personally recommend, won the 2018 Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing and was shortlisted for the 2021 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Priyanka?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Writers Center for having me, and congratulations to Richard Powers. This is a real treat for me. I'm going to be reading from my novel, The City of Good Death. This is a book that takes place in the real Indian city of Benares. The story takes place in a death hostel in Benares. Benares is very special because for Hindus, it's considered the holiest city. Should you pass away there, it's a death that grants you an instant release from the cycle of reincarnation that Hinduism kind of revolves around. The book opens with a dead body that's pulled out of the Ganga River. Very soon after, a very unwelcome guest of the supernatural variety takes up residence in this death hostel. And the section I'm going to be reading involves the residents trying to figure out what to do about this unwelcome guest. This guest is very consistent in its disturbances. It decides to come at 2 in the morning every night It resides in the washroom of this death hostel amongst the water pots. And the only thing that can make it stop is when the manager goes to the doorway and says a single word, Bhaiya, which means brother in Hindi. The characters are Pramesh, who's the manager of the death hostel, the assistant, Mohan, Pramesh's wife, Shobha, the head priest, Narendra, and there's a couple of other characters who hopefully you'll get to meet in this section. So I hope you enjoy. And I am not an actress, so please be kind in certain sections. I'll try, I'll do my best. The need for an exorcism was not unusual on the level of finding out, say, that the banwala at the end of the fruit bazaar, who was staying with his in-laws because of money troubles, had been scaling the walls from his upper story bedroom window to meet his neighbor's wife in secret each night. Everyone had a ghost or two living in their house or some side alley shed. What everyone contested, often in hot arguments that drew crowds in the city's lanes, was how to expel the ghost, whom to go to, and when to allow the presence to simply stay, since a little disturbance here and there could be tolerated if it meant a few extra rupees saved in the pocket. The morning after the fourth night, Narendra broke his silence to reject that last option. It's our duty to free that soul, he said, taking pains not to mention Sagar by name. At some point, it was diverted. It forgot where it was meant to go and instead chose to stay here. It's suffering, and it's making us suffer as well. So we must remind it. Someone to exorcise it, Pramesh asked, and when Narendra tilted his head in agreement, he sat, thinking, who can we trust? I have a man in mind, Narendra said. He does not usually do these things, not anymore. But I spoke with him yesterday, and he, Govind Bhai, was willing to come and see for himself and to try, if he could. So that was who he'd gone to see. Watching the priest hold his glass with steady hands, lift it up to his mouth and blow on the liquid while never breaking his gaze, Pramesh wondered if perhaps he dreamed seeing Narendra frozen that first night. And then he wished, not for the first time, that he'd also dreamed the rest of it. The white-haired man who arrived at the gate was short, his head barely reaching Pramesh's shoulder, and he carried with him only a newspaper packet and a peacock feather. Any illusion that the packet held the tools of his trade evaporated when, sitting in Pramesh's office, he unwrapped it and pulled out fingerfuls of fried moong dal, munching away while Narendra detailed the problem in the washroom. Narendraji mentioned you no longer attend to such matters, Pramesh said, gesturing toward his head priest, so we're grateful that you came. Old friends, Govind said. Craving satisfied at last, he rolled the top of the newspaper cone and set it on Pramesh's desk. But it's true, I stopped doing this work years ago. Not enough money, Pramesh ventured. Too much. Once people find out you have the talent, they don't stop coming, and then you start to see ghosts everywhere, Manager Bhai. You realize sometimes the problem is not the ghost, but the person wanting to exorcise it. There's no solution yet for moving people to another place if they will not go. I wanted a simpler life. Do you think it will be easy, removing this ghost? Let me see it first. In the washroom, he said. They led him to the space where the water pots sat in neat rows once again, returned there by Mohan after moving them had proved useless. Govind walked around the space, murmuring mantras and circling the room several times in a way that reminded Pramesh of Narendra, walking the perimeter of the bhavan with his prayer beads. At times he stroked or tapped the pots with a peacock feather, or he brushed the walls and the corners of the washroom. 2 hours past midnight, you said, the man asked after his final round, when he came to a stop a few steps from the pots and stood contemplating the quiet brass. Yes, at least that's how it was the last 4 nights. There's something here, Govind said, but I'd like to see what it does. Strange, it almost feels as if there are multiple ghosts. It happens, you know. Sometimes there are 3 or 4, and they all have different wants. Wants? Oh yes, the thing it wanted before it died. You have to satisfy that want, somehow. It's easier that way. You can always banish it regardless, Narendra asked. It was an odd feeling, Pramesh thought, to hear his head priest ask a question rather than provide the answer. If you wish, but better to wait, Govind demurred. I prefer to see what it does. At the gate, Govind took his leave, promising to return in the evening. He looked back into the courtyard as he shoved his feet into his sandals. A place like this, Manager Bhai. It surprises me that you haven't needed me before, The people who come here don't intend to linger, Pramesh said quietly. If they show up at our gate, it's because they're ready. Perhaps, Govind said, or perhaps you were lucky and the spirits all stayed quiet until this latest one showed up. We'll see. He raised his hand in farewell and went on his way. Guests rarely demanded admittance to the bhavan late at night, the unspoken rule being that once Mohan locked the gates for the evening, Shankar Bhavan would accept no one else until the next day. The iron creaked in protest when Govind arrived, his white hair shining in the deep black night, another paper cone clutched in his hands. Shobha had cleaned up from the evening meal some hours ago, but still tried to offer him food, irked that a stranger to the bhavan, and an elder at that, had decided to bring his own, and at such a late hour. Next time, he said, palms folded together, declining the meal. The task comes first. The cone held puffed rice mixed with save, golden with spiced oil, and he held it open to all, rattling the contents when Pramesh, Narendra, and Mohan all declined. Well, he said, eating on his own. No point in all of you remaining awake. 2 hours after midnight, you said. Shall I wake you, Manager Bhai? A few minutes before. We hardly sleep around here anymore, Pramesh said. But he agreed that it was best they all go to bed and convene again closer to the time. He woke some minutes before the hour, his body as tense as a spring in a clock. The pots erupted then. They seemed louder tonight, more violent, penetrating the ancient stone of the building and making its way to the upper story of the family quarters, sending Shobha's hairpins on the side table skipping and shaking to the floor, her rolled up sewing shivering with the vibrations. Pramesh found Govind in the pitch black of the washroom, without even the lamp that Mohan had left for him, standing in the furthest corner and watching. He seemed completely in control of himself. No green visage like Mohan's, no frozen terror, no sick unease at being so close to something so unnatural. He was so calm that Pramesh almost forgot why he was there, and only when the old man looked up, questioning, did the manager remember to say the word of silence. The sound and motion cut out instantly, echoes ringing in the dark. Mohan, lingering around the washroom until then, stepped into the doorway, his round frame smudged in shadow. Some water, perhaps, Govind asked. He moved stiffly at first and was slow to exit the washroom. Seated in the kitchen, he refused the glass Pramesh offered and instead bade the manager to pour the water into his cupped hands. He gulped a glass's worth and then another before speaking. Has it done this every night? Yes, this is the 5th. It's perhaps more assertive than most, Govind allowed. But count yourself lucky it hasn't possessed any of you. And it obeys when you speak to it. Very strange. He peered at the manager. What was it you said again? To make it stop. Heat rose to Pramesh's neck. He glanced at Narendra, silent and still. Govind looked at him steadily. There's no profit in this business if I talk about what I've seen, Manager Bhai. Bhaiya, Pramesh said, eyes unable to meet anyone else's. The pressure on his chest returned, a now familiar weight. Govind showed no reaction. He merely took another sip of water. Can you banish it now, this instant? Morning would be better, Govind said. His eyes were alert with a new spark. He reached for his cone of puffed rice and popped a few more grains, considering. Is anything wrong? Pramesh asked. No, nothing wrong. Different, perhaps. Not wrong. He chewed some more. It's already seated itself, he said. It's an inconvenience, but you don't need to do anything just yet. All I would be doing is moving it elsewhere. Whether here or there, the hope is that it will move on, eventually. And as I said, it hasn't possessed anyone, and that's often the bigger difficulty. He dusted his hands, twisted the top of the cone, and shoved it away. Are you sure you wouldn't rather wait? No. Narendra spoke before Pramesh could. Nothing could be gained from waiting. And if moving it can help it along, when it never should have been here to begin with, then it's our duty to do so. He looked at Pramesh, who swiveled his chin. Well, it's certainly one of the more extraordinary possessions I've seen, but not the worst. I'll stay the night, if you don't mind, Manager Bhai, but as you wish, first thing in the morning. It will be done. Is there anything you need? A few things I must beg from your wife. Cooked rice, a lemon or two, cloves and cardamom. Oh, and another thing, if you could ask your wife to lead all the women out, to the ghats, to the market, wherever. And if they could stay away until I'm finished, that would be most helpful, Manjubai. Anything, Pramesh said. It will all be ready for you. His breath still felt shallow, as if someone were sitting on him. But there would be an end. Everything had an end to it, both good fortune and the bitterest of trials, or so Shobha liked to tell him. The next morning, Shobha went around to all the rooms, speaking to the women. She wanted to take Rani with her, but the child was still warm and had spent the rest of the night coughing. Leave her here, Govind said. She's not yet old enough to be a distraction to the ghosts like the rest of them. Shobha colored as she realized why Govind had also said nothing about moving any of the dying women from the bhavan. Rani was too young, and those ghost guests were too old, but the women in between were capable of the thing that barred them from the temples and rendered them impure each month. They're attracted to such things, ghosts are, Govind continued, oblivious to Shobha's discomfort. They have their likes and dislikes, just like the living do. Anything from a living body, blood, human leavings, it all acts like a magnet, and the ghost cannot resist. So reluctantly, Shobha dosed Rani with black pepper and turmeric spiced milk sweetened with honey, tucked a light blanket over her, and left her dozing on the rope bed in the kitchen. Then she gathered the women and led them all to bathe at the river as Govind had requested. They filed out in a tidy parade, unobserved except by old Mrs. Jalwa across the street, who sat at her window, fingers doubling the speed at which they moved over her prayer beads, her nod nearly imperceptible when Shobha raised a hand in greeting. Govind crouched over the tray Shobha had prepared and scooped palmfuls of rice, still warm, added some water to make the mixture whole, and formed 3 balls. He borrowed a knife from Pramesh and set that next to the lemons. A cluster of cloves and cardamom sat in the tray's center. With his peacock feather shivering atop these things, he entered the washroom, Pramesh and Narendra following. Not the right thing, Dave muttered as the 3 walked by. Brahmins consorting with exorcists. Also not the right thing for ghosts to consort with the living, but here we are, Narendra replied from the dark room, standing beside Govind as that man set the tray down near the pots. Have you visited each of the dying today? Dave relented, setting off to join Mohan on his rounds of the bhavan while Loknath read aloud, the younger priest wearing a sulky look that reminded Pramesh of Rani when she did not get her way. With the women gone, the men were free to talk as loudly as they wished, with no fear of offending female sensibilities or worse, being contradicted. While many guests stayed in their rooms finding nothing fascinating in an impending exorcism, the rest crowded around the mouth of the washroom or sat nearby on the walkway, hoping the scene might provide some entertainment, something to break the monotony of waiting for their kin's final exit. 3 rice balls. At home, the man who does this kind of thing always has 4. Mine just uses 1, but who knows, Bhaiya, yours probably keeps the extra few to eat. None of these things are real. Not even the thing in the washroom is real. It's probably, as that assistant says, an animal, something that looks for shelter at night and ends up here. Yes, but what sort of animal makes you feel ill from 3 rooms away? And the sound, how do you explain that? Govind began with his peacock feather, passing rapid strokes over the pots, the ground, the walls, even reaching his short arms up to the ceiling, all the while mumbling rapid mantras whose cadence Pramesh recognized, but whose exact words eluded him. Govind went on for some time, pausing only to draw breath. When he stopped, he gave Pramesh and Narendra a meaningful look, squatted down, and grabbed a clove from the tray. He held it out toward the pots, never breaking his gaze on it. Suddenly, he howled. "Where is the son of a dog?" he cried in a voice totally unlike his own, and Pramesh felt a chill pass over him. "Here, aren't you? Land here. No, here." "Ah, fine. Wander. We both know this is your place. No son of a dog can resist. You will come to me eventually." His arm swooped and dropped down and pulled back up as if something were pulling his hand in many directions. He continued to curse in that unearthly voice, looking like a man trying to catch a fly with only his thumb and forefinger. Alarmed, the manager looked at Narendra, but the priest remained in his traditional stance, motionless but for the fingers that worked on his beads, his mouth moving in silent prayer. Pramesh had seen exorcisms in his village before, had seen them even here in Kashi, and the crass language and harsh theatrics should not have surprised him. But in those other cases, with disheveled women rolling around on the ground or grunting in a lane, shouting obscenities, or with men speaking without the benefit of drawing breath, servants to a tongue they could not stop even when their faces turned red. Nothing that the exorcist did seemed extreme. The aggression of the spirit controlling the person demanded an equal reply. Perhaps what had happened in the washroom over the last 5 nights was just as excessive. But Sagar was not some malevolent spirit. Pramesh stayed, unsure of what else to do, but with every word from Govind, he felt further conflicted. The spot behind his eyebrow emitted a low ache. Meanwhile, Govind kept trying to catch the ghost, moving where the spirit seemed to go. After some time, he tired, and he set the clove down and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. He blinked and looked at the manager, and when he spoke, his voice was his own again. You don't like it, I can see, Manager Bai. But one must speak to them in that way. They don't know how to listen to anything else, believe me. And actually, I'm being much milder than usual. He hasn't possessed anyone, so expelling him doesn't require the same harshness. So he's here. Pramesh had been trying to feel something, to feel a whiff of Sagar, but the room itself doesn't always have. Oh yes, he can't make himself seen or felt to most people because the night is when he can be most vocal. But I know he's here. You get a feeling for them after so many years. Pramesh turned his eyes to the pots. Bhaiya, what are you still doing here? Why do you linger? He willed his cousin to listen to him, to realize his folly in staying behind. Pramesh rubbed his forehead, the old pain lingering. Just then, the exorcist let out a delighted shout, and the pots shivered in response. I have you! Ah, I have you! Didn't I say, didn't I? Govind cut the lemon as a small sacrifice of life, and then he stuffed the clove into one of the rice balls. He pushed the other 2 rice balls into the first, making a single large wad of rice, the ghost residing within. It's done, he said, gleeful, holding the rice ball up for the manager to see. Pramesh felt immediate relief. The sorrow would come later, he knew, but that sorrow would be born of his natural feeling for the cousin he'd lost, rather than guilt over failing his duty to him. And now, straight to the gas. I won't release it there. Pramesh wagged his chin, and Govind rushed past him toward the Bhavan gate, Narendra following. I'll come by in the morning, Manager Bai, Govind said. But you'll sleep well tonight. Believe me. Thank you.
Eugenia Kim's debut novel, The Calligrapher's Daughter, won the Borders Original Voices Award, was shortlisted for the Dayton Library Peace Prize, and was a Washington Post Best Historical Novel and Critics Pick. Her second novel, The Kinship of Secrets, was a Library Reads Pick, an Amazon Best Book of the Month, and an Amazon Best Book of the Month. She teaches fiction and nonfiction at Fairfield University's MFA Creative Writing Program, and I'm delighted to say that she has recently joined the board at the Writers Center.
Hello. I'm so delighted to be here and really honored to be part of this evening that honors Richard Powers, and we have other luminary guests, including my fellow readers. So it's made me kind of nervous. I'm going to read from The Kinship of Secrets. I was told that the theme for the evening was stories that are more than human, about being more than human. And so I considered in my novel, where are times when, humanity is really challenged? And considering what's happening in Ukraine and Yemen and on our own borders, refugees from war is such a terrible decision to have to make. And so there is a section where this novel is about a family separated by war. So it's based on one of the many stories from my own family. In this story, the half of the family lives in America, Calvin Cho and his wife Najin, and their 5-year-old daughter, Rian. They live in America. They travel to America just to stay for 1 or 2 years, and then they would come back to Korea, where they had left the second daughter at home with the grandparents and uncle and aunt. So that separation got exacerbated by the Korean War and lasted for 16 years. So this chapter is a few days after the Russian-supported North Korea invades South Korea, Seoul, on Sunday, June 27, 1950. And this begins the Korean War. The family in America, they hear about the invasion, but there's no way they can reach their family. The telegrams go unanswered. There's no telephone in the Seoul house. So as smoke begins to fringe the horizon around Seoul, Inja, who is the 4-year-old here, precocious 4-year-old, her uncle and grandfather decide to leave the house and flee with other refugees going south. So uncle pulls a cart, an old ox cart with their belongings, and grandmother sits on top with Inja. And he pulls while grandfather and aunt push from behind as they leave their home on a Tuesday. This isn't taped into the book, it's about 20 pages in, and it's a chapter called Flowers. And I chose this in honor of Richard Powers and his deep connection with nature. The sun at mid-afternoon casts short shadows among the people heading south. The crowd grew thicker than before, and its earlier mood of panic had dulled, as if the air itself were tired. Inja woke from her nap, her neck complaining, saliva pooled beneath her tongue. She was hungry and noticed grandmother shifting in a way that indicated she might need the bedpan. Inja's mother had set the stellar example of American ingenuity after learning about grandmother's stroke. Uncle's back was bent and sweaty with exertion from an uphill climb. When they reached a level crossing, he unwound the ropes, stretched his arms and shoulders, and stood on the cart shaft to see the vista ahead. Inja sat tall to see what he saw. People and their bundles filled the downhill road far ahead to a turn toward the railroad station and the bridges that crossed the Han River. Whirling dust and plumes of heavy vehicles clouded the distance, and the canvas tops of army trucks showed them attempting to maneuver upstream through the mass exodus. More people joined the main artery from side streets, and women balancing huge bundles on their head. The men carried the most surprising things lashed to the A-frames on their backs: a chest of drawers, a bag of grain twice the size of a carrier, a frail elder. Grandmother gave Aunt a jug and gourd to dole out drinking water, and Uncle edged around the cart. "We should reconsider Suman," he said to grandfather. His firm stance was directed at Aunt, who would challenge him. Inja settled closer to grandmother to have a lot to hide in should they begin fighting. But grandfather said, "What's your thinking, son?" and thus closed the possibility of criticism. The old man, a vigorous 70, commanded the respect his age required. A few wisps of gray circled the back of grandfather's head like a victor's laurel, and his goatee was as stiff and white as the traditional clothes he wore. He had fewer wrinkles than grandmother, though he was 10 years older, and no little spots on his cheeks like the other elders at church. Inja had once overheard Aunt whispering to cook that grandfather wasn't wrinkled because he was a lazy man who never worked a day in his life. Inja was so shocked and ashamed to have heard such a declaration about a revered elder that she couldn't even weigh its truth. "Let's avoid Suan altogether and cross at the ferry," Uncle tapped the cart. "That chaos ahead looks impossible for this beast. We'll go through the alleys to the fire station and take the hills behind Itaewon to the river." Itaewon housed the army hospital in garrison. "Boots and cows and fix the stable, eh?" said Aunt, taunting with a proverb. "The cart will be worse at the bridge with these crowds," said grandfather, silencing Aunt. "The ferry's a good idea, and we can get news at Itaewon." Though Inja regretted not getting to meet the orphans in Suan, She hoped to see the handsome uniformed soldiers performing their military exercises when they passed the base. I'm picking Bungie by way of Sangha. Grandfather nodded, and the decision was made. With much shouting and pleas of forbearance, they pushed and dragged the cart to the nearest alley. The narrow lanes, broken cobbles, and rugged dried mud made the cart sway and bump, but they soon turned a corner where the only crowds were dogs rooting in trash heaps and gullies. After a maze of backyard walls, they stopped near a patch of bamboo, and Inja scrambled down to help Aunt carry Grandmother piggyback to the shade. They found the white enamel bedpan, and the old blanket they'd used as a curtain. Uncle changed his shirt and said he'd see how far they were from the ferry. Aunt waved him off. "You'll get us lost again," she turned to Inja, her voice rising. "Did you sit on this?" She held a basket wrapped in cloth, the rice and barley balls Cook had prepared for the journey, now concave with the indentation that someone hadn't sat on them. Though it was Grandmother who sat on the food, Inja stiffened for the tongue lashing, but Uncle said, "What does it matter? Leave her be." He smiled. "She only made it sweeter for us." Adoration for her uncle flooded Inja's chest, and she wanted to run and hug his legs, but he turned and strode toward the river ferry. The family rested and ate, and Inja climbed on the cart to find her book. A streak of black screamed across the sky and crashed into distant bursts of thunder and smoke. Two others followed, farther away. Grandfather helped Inja clamber from the cart and sat her next to Aunt. "Stay close." He skirted the walls to see better, but came back shaking his head. Aunt tidied their belongings and readied a gourd of water and seed for Uncle. Uncle soon returned, his face grim. "The ferry's impossible." He ate the rice ball in a few bites and described the Army's attempts to commandeer the ferry amid thousands of refugees surrounding the dock. "They're bludgeoning their way to the river," he said. "We were right to avoid the train station. That explosion means the city is probably bruised." Aunt gasped and Grandmother sighed, and a dart of fear pierced Inja's sense of adventure. Uncle turned to her, his face changed by a smile. "But I saw Kang at the ferry. We'll go to the hills behind Itaewon and he'll meet us there." Inja's heart knocked to hear this name. Kang was the porter who toted the heavy American packages from the ferry to their home, with 2, sometimes 3 cartons roped together on his A-frame. He spent his days at the Sodingo ferry dock, waiting to be called for jobs that would earn him a few chon per day. Once Uncle saw how Kang favored his niece, he designated him as their porter, an enormous privilege for a simple laborer, the likes of whom numbered hundreds at the docks, railroad station, and in the alleys of factories and back doors of businesses, all vying to transport any sort of load. Though his mouth stank from rotted teeth, Kang always carried a small flower tucked behind his ear, in winter a feather or sprig of pine, which he would solemnly present to Inja after he plucked the cardboard boxes on their porch. A giant man, whose thighs were as thick as her waist, and his head as bald and brown as a chestnut. When she shook his hand to thank him for the honeysuckle sprig or dandelion, her entire hand, fingers wide, fit with room to spare within his calloused palm. His gnarled hands were rough, but his touch was gentle, and when he bent to speak to her, he always turned his mouth aside. So to hear Uncle mention Kang filled her stomach with special warmth. Uncle was saying, "And he knows a man with a rack behind the temple at Gyeonggangi, 2 kilometers for the right feet." Aunt patted her waistline where she tied a cloth belt thick with bills beneath her blouse. But Uncle said he had enough on hand and they should leave. Rested in the renewed urgency, the Han family made good time through the alleys until they came upon a dirt path that cut through the hilly woods behind Itaewon's army base. No one was about, and a foreboding quiet swept through a grassy meadow. They kept going until Inja saw a familiar form sauntering between the trees ahead. "It's Kang!" She hopped down from the cart and ran. She hadn't realized how puny she felt until the lion had joined the party. How could his massive size and strength not protect them from the reds? When she neared, he bent to offer her a flowering quince branch he tucked in the back of his rope belt. Its fragrance, tangy and sweet, erased her apprehension when she was grateful. He lifted her beside grandmother, who reached to smell the persimmon-colored flowers. The men conferred in hushed tones. Kang shouldered the ropes beside Uncle, and the two pulled the cart at a brisk pace for the remainder of their journey to the river. No one spoke except for grandfather, who walked beside the cart and pointed out to Inja certain things along the way, the waning sun streaming in slanted beams through a young grove of birches, a tiny rhododendron bush with a single violet-hued flower, the scent of musk and loamy pine when they wheeled through an old part of the woods, a chipmunk's striped back flashing on the forest floor. The moon, almost full, shimmered through the tall reeds behind the riverside temple at Dehamganyi. Cattails rustled with murmurs of many people hidden within. Inja sat beside grandmother on the bank by the maiden grass, while Uncle greeted the raft's owner with an American-style handshake to pass a wad of notes. "Well met," said the man, putting Uncle first in line. The raft slid up, a broad, flat craft reeking of tar and dead fish. Its two occupants, pole men who changed sides. Kang rolled the cart to the center of the raft, shocked its wheels, and the family clustered around it. Inja stood on the cart shank beside Uncle, who wrapped his arms around her. The raft owner told everyone to sit on their bundles or to hold them aloft to allow space for others. He cautioned them to remain quiet and still as the cross current pulled fast and he feared the enemy had reached the riverbanks. 15 more people boarded and the river sloshed over the raft, soaking those sitting on the outside. Kang stood on the wet wood nearby, and nearest the edge in front of him was a young mother balancing a big round basket on her head, and her son, a boy about Inja's age, who sat on a bundle. The raft lurched and the current swept it downriver. The dank rot of the marshy riverbank faded, and the craft's foul odor dissipated in the night's cool breeze. The crossing was slow, hand-pulled efforts to tack against the current, and someone whispered, "It might drag us as far down as the ferry." Debris and unknown floating things tapped the edges of the raft, and Inja feared they were bodies. Something big crashed into the edge that plowed the current, and the woman with the basket lost her hold. The basket fell and hit her son, and the boy and the basket tumbled with a quiet splash into the river. She screamed, "My baby!" and jumped in. Uncle cried out and reached for her. She floundered and slipped below the dark water. A man struck Uncle and others wrestled him to the wet wood. Grandfather was beside Inja in an instant and held on to her as the raft swayed. Kang kicked the mother's bundle aside and leaped into the water. Uncle shouted, "No!" and someone muffled him. Inja strained to see in the moonlight. Her eyes couldn't open wide enough. Far downriver, Kang's big head bobbed once and disappeared beneath the surface. Uncle went lax and silent, and grandfather touched Inja's cheek to turn her eyes from the river. Thank you.
I don't want to follow that. Wow. It's Stan Robinson. Stan Robinson is a New York Times best-selling author, the winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. He's an author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy and the critically acclaimed 40 Signs of Rain and The Years of Rice and Salt. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine, and he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. He lives in Davis, California, and I'm glad he's here tonight.
Thank you. My thanks to the Writers Center and to the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. Pleasure to be with you. And tonight, I'm going to read from Richard Powers' most recent novel, Bewilderment. It has a couple of major characters, a father-son pair, and the father is an astrobiologist. A title that gives me a lot of pleasure to think about. A somewhat hypothetical career, I presume, at this point. And then the son is somewhere on the spectrum, you might say, although I would suggest to you that this metaphor spectrum should be shifted to a kaleidoscope. So these two live together by themselves, and often at night they will kind of tell bedtime stories that are somewhat based on the father's work on studying other planets by indirect means. So there are about, I don't know, maybe 10 to a dozen of these modern equivalents of bedtime stories, and I'm just going to read a few of them to you. On Geminus, we were trapped on opposite sides of a terrible meridian. The planet's sun was small, cool, and red. Geminus lay so close in that the star had captured its rotation. One side remained forever in scalding light. The other side stayed night, icy and perpetual. Life germinated in the strict twilight between permanent noon and midnight. In that band between burning and frozen, winds whipped the air and currents drove the water. Creatures evolved to exploit the loops of energy, moving bits of morning to warm the blackness and bits of night to cool the endless blaze. Life pushed deeper into both halves of the wind-whipped landscape. Tendrils of habitability seeped down canyons and up watersheds, creeping from the temperate boundary toward the extremes. Life on Geminus split into two kingdoms, one of ice and of fire, each adapting to half of the bipolar planet. For the boldest pilgrims, there was no turning back. Even the temperate boundary strip became fatal. Intelligence arose twice. Each kind solved its own impossible claims. But the minds of day failed to find the night intelligible, while night's minds couldn't comprehend the day. They shared only one bit of common knowledge. Life would never exist, quote, over the age. We traveled to Geminus together, my son and I, but we each arrived alone. I found myself in a wind-fed town on the side of constant day. I searched throughout the habitable strip, but couldn't find them. The local inhabitants were no help. I'd imagined that people of endless day would be cheerful and upbeat. Their sky was filled with one single unchanging light, blocking out all signs of a universe. They lived as if there could be nothing but here and now and this. The thought stunted them. Their sciences and arts had stalled in infancy. They never even invented the telescope. On Geminus, seasons were places. Walking a few miles towards the boundary belt took me from August to January. He had to be somewhere on the side of constant night. What people would he find there, shaped by lethal cold? Cunning and ingenious, diggers of heat mines and farmers of subterranean fungi. Brutal, barbaric, and depressed killers, competing for every priceless calorie. He had been looking for me as well. Nearing the temperate boundary belt, I saw him a long way off, rushing from the other side. I broke into a run, but he held up his hands to stop me. I realized there on the edge of darkness, he had seen the raw night sky. He looked at stars as no one on earth ever would again. He'd seen change in time, cycles and variety, math and stories as countless, subtle, and various as the black-backed constellations. He called to me from over the standing edge of dark, "Dad, Dad, you have no idea." But I was trapped in light and couldn't cross over. The first time Tedia died, the comet tore off a third of the planet and turned it into a moon. Nothing on Tedia survived. After tens of millions of years, the atmosphere came back, water flowed again, and life sparked a second time. Cells learned the symbiotic trick of how to combine. Large creatures spread once more into every niche of the planet. Then a distant gamma ray burst dissolved Tedia's ozone shield and ultraviolet radiation killed most of it. Patches of light survived in the deepest oceans, so this time it was faster coming back. Ingenious forests set out again across the continents. 100 million years after that, just as a species of cetacean was beginning to make tools and art, the neighborhood star system supernovae, and Tedia had to start again. The problem was that the planet lay too near the galactic center, packed in too closely to the calamities of other stars. Extinction would never be possible, but there were periods of grace between the devastations. 40 resets in, the calm lasted long enough for civilization to develop. Intelligent bear people built villages and mastered agriculture. They harnessed steam, channeled electricity, learned and built simple machines. But when their archaeologists revealed how often they broke into, when their astronomers figured out why, society broke down and destroyed itself, millennia before the next supernova war. This too happened again and again. But let's go see, my son. Let's just have a look. By the time we arrived, the planet had died and resurrected itself 1,001 times. The sun was almost spent and would soon expand to engulf the entire world. But life went on assembling endless new platforms. It didn't know anything. It couldn't do otherwise. We discovered creatures high up in Tedia's jagged young mountains. They were toothed and branching, and they held so still for so long that we mistook them for plants. But they greeted us, putting the word welcome directly into our heads. They probed my son. I could feel their thoughts going. You want to know if you should warn us, my practice in that. You want us to be ready, but you don't want to cause us pain. My son knocked again. He was crying. Don't worry, the doomed to creatures told us. There are two kinds of endless. Ours is the better. The planet Pelagos had many times more surface than Earth. It was covered in water. A single ocean made the Pacific look like the Great Lakes. One sparse chain of tiny volcanic islands ran through that immensity, its punctuation sprinkled through an empty book hundreds of pages long. The endless ocean was shallow in places, kilometers deep in others. Life spread through its latitudes from steam to frozen. Hosts of creatures turned the ocean bottoms into underwater forests. Giant blimps migrated from pole to pole, never stopping, each half of their brains to the trees to sleep. Intelligent kelp, hundreds of meters long, spelled messages in colors that rippled up the lengths of their stalks. Annelids practiced agriculture, and crustaceans built high-rise cities. Clades of fish evolved communal rituals indistinguishable from religion. But nothing could use fire, or smoke rivers, or build any but the simplest tools. So Pelagos diversified and invented new ones, each stranger from the last. Over the eons, the few scattered islands radiated life as if each were its own planet. None of them was large enough to incubate large predators. Each pinprick of land was a sealed terrarium, sporting enough species for a small Earth. Dozens of dispersed intelligent species spoke millions of languages. Even the pigeons numbered in the hundreds. Pigeon languages, I should say. The town was bigger than a hamlet. Every few miles we came across a speaking thing whose shape and color and form were totally new. The most universally useful adaptation seemed to be humility. The two of us swam along veins of shallow reef down into underwater forests. We scrambled up on islands whose complex communities were threaded into immense trading networks with islands far away. Caravans took years, even generations, to complete a deal. No telescopes, Dad. No rocket ships. No computers. No radios. Only amazement. It didn't seem like an outrageous truth. How many planets are like this one? There might be none. There might be everything. Well, I'll never hear from anyone. The planet Stasis looked so much like Earth. The flowing water in green mountains, where we touched down, the woody trees and flowering plants, the snails, the worms, and flying beetles, even the bony creatures were cousins of those we knew. How can that be? He asked. I told him what some astronomers now thought: a billion or more planets at least as lucky as ours in the Milky Way alone. In a universe 93 billion light years across, rare earths sprang up like weeds. But a few days on Stasis showed the place to be as strange as any. The planet's axis had little tilt, which meant one monotone season at every latitude. A dense atmosphere smoothed out fluctuations in temperature. Larger tectonic plates recycled its continents with catastrophe. Few meteors ever threaded the gauntlet of massive nearby planets, and so the climate on Stasis had stayed stable through most of its existence. We walked to the equator across the layers of planetary parfait. Species counts in every band were huge and filled with specimens. Each predator hunted one prey. Every flower kept a pollinator of its own. No creature migrated. Many plants or animals. Many plants ate animals. Plants and animals lived in every kind of symbiosis. Larger living entities weren't organisms at all. They were coalitions, associations, and parliaments. We walked on to one of the poles. The boundaries between biomes ran like property lines. No flux of seasons blurred or softened. From one step to the next, deciduous trees stopped and conifers began. Everything on Stasis was built to solve its own private spot. Everything knew one infinitely deep thing. The sum of the world that they left. Nothing alive to thrive anywhere else. A move of even a few kilometers north or south tended to be fatal. Is there intelligence? My son asked. Is anything aware? I told him no. Nothing on Stasis needed to remember much or predict much further out than now. In such steadiness, there was no great call to adjust or improvise or second guess or model much of anything. He thought about that. So, trouble is what creates intelligence? I said yes. Crisis and change and upheaval. His voice turned sad and wondrous. That means we'll never find anyone smarter than us. Okay, last one. There was a planet that couldn't figure out where everyone was. It died of loneliness. That happened billions of times in our galaxy alone. Thanks very much.
And now I'd like to introduce our guest of honor for the evening, who needs no introduction, and yet I'm going to introduce him. Richard Powers is the author of 13 novels, including the Overstory and Orfeo, and the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, the Pulitzer Prize, and the National Book Award for all this much stuff. He lives in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. With pleasure.
I have to admit that when I learned that the weekend was going to involve something called the Richard Powers Tribute, I broke out in a massive case of Midwestern self-effacement. And it reminded me of my favorite bit in Susan Cheever's memoir of her father, John. She said that he used to wake up from nightmares screaming, "Oh, no, thank you, no, thank you." And he tells me I have 3 minutes to tie together these 4 writers. Unusual quartet. And I thought, okay, we've all come from such different paths, and we've all followed such different trajectories. And what can I find that can tie together an accomplished knitter, a long-time professional graphic designer, a mountaineer and terraformer, and I will include myself in the quartet, a recovering computer programmer. And I thought that the link might be a great Proto-Indo-European root text. And so whether it's Priyanka's textiles, or Eugenia's textures and techniques, Stan's technologies, it's texts that weave us all together from threads of thought, spinning them around. It's interesting to think that also deriving from this webby thread are subtle tissue architect and pretext. What I have awakened every morning thanking who's ever out there, what's ever out there. And my sense of daily luck at stumbling on a profession devoted to something that by definition doesn't fit any other category. So the novel at its birth was what's new? What doesn't fit in any other genre? And that still is what makes it singularly beautiful. There simply is nothing that ties this genre together. It's nothing but disparate threads. Total freedom to follow any thread anywhere you want. That's what I've spent the last 4 years doing. And even now, it's the differences between us as writers that gets me really excited, much more so than the similarities and the overlaps. I love that every novelist is constantly fabricating him or herself out of whole cloth. I've read Stan for decades, and I will learn from him forever, and any chance to cross paths with him is always a special occasion. But tonight, I think it has been even more special to make 2 extraordinary new discoveries. And if that is the price of the prize, then enduring a tribute is something I can easily do. In fact, I can put a little salve on that Midwestern rash and say, yes, please.
Thank you all so much for coming. Writer Center workshops, free, open to the public events like these. Poet Lore, the oldest poetry journal in the country. Thank you to Friends of the Library for selling books. Thank you for F. Scott Fitzgerald for all the things, and thank you for this incredible. Should I have been more articulate? Sorry. I'm still underwater with all your words. So thank you to this incredible panel of writers, A lot of times we say at the Writer Center, the best thing you can do to support a writer is to buy their books. Well, tonight you get to do that, and we'll have another table, and you can actually get them signed. So thank you again for being here. Gary Berg Cross, you want to come and take us out?